All right. I mean, that's a random way to start, and that's not even my accent, but it's with great excitement that the Between Breaths podcast is back. I've had a little break for a few months whilst holiday and other lots of bits and pieces going on, but very excited to be back with the Between Breaths podcast for another series, of which I do not know how long the series will last. I've always said from the start with the Between Breaths podcast, I want it to be um, the highest quality podcast work that I can do and get the best guests on for you. And you're in for a right treat today. And I would try to do one each week, but it may not happen. So we were going weekly. We've had a bit of a break. We're going to come back. We'll try to be weekly, depending on how the workload's going. But as I said, trying to bring you the best guests that the planet has to offer. And we have one of the big dogs from the world of breathing and respiratory science, and that is Martin McPhilimey, who is on Instagram as Performance Through Health. And he is rubbing shoulders with the likes of Brian McKenzie, with the likes of Dave Wood in New Zealand, and a wealth of experience that goes back further than you. If you follow him already on Instagram, you probably didn't realize his whole backstory. So we get into that into the start of this, and then we really delve into some nitty gritty, understanding science, understanding papers, helping you to know how you can go and take your own deep dives, distilling some myths around carbon dioxide, and a whole host more. And I just want to say, like, Martin's such a lovely guy. He's trying to do, and he's really great at what he does, and he's trying to, do a really good thing within this space of breathing science. And I really value his work and appreciate his time on the podcast. So just wanted to give him that shout out, and excited that we can restart the podcast with him as a guest. Before we get started with the podcast, we are back, but the podcast sponsor has not changed. We are still sponsored by Ketone IQ from hvmn.com, and that's because I am still using it and still enjoying it. So why wouldn't we still be sponsored by HVMN? So if you haven't come across Ketone IQ, head over to the link in the profile. You'll see all of the detailed information about it. But essentially, this is a product that is helping with my sleep, it's helping with my focus and concentration, and helping with my endurance during my ultra running training. I've been using it now for, it must be over a year, and continue to use it. And if you haven't checked it out, do so. There is a 10% discount code, JACO10, if you head over to hvmn.com/JACO. That code will go straight into your discount. And the link will be in the profile below or on my website, probreathwork.com/blog. That's the page where all my blogs and podcasts are. And there is a link directly there to hvmn.com. So without further ado, I'll have a little bit of a sip of the Ketone IQ so I can be nice and focused and concentrated whilst listening to Martin McPhilimey on the Between Breaths podcast. We enter this world taking our first breath, and sadly, we leave this place taking our last. And what I want to do with this podcast is to explore what happens between those breaths. I'm David Jackson, Jacko, and this is the Between Breaths podcast. Okay, as I mentioned in the intro, very excited to have one of the big dogs of the current breathing space that is I've been saying for a while, Martin, that it feels like we're on the cusp of it sort of booming, but I had that sense this week as well, with just some emails I've had and opportunities coming up and things. But then, seeing people like yourself doing, it feels like taking things to another level. So I just want to welcome and just say how excited I am to speak to you, and to reciprocate. I think I was on your podcast 2 years ago, but Martin McPhilimey, welcome to the Between Breaths podcast. Say hello to the listeners.
Hello, everyone. Jacko, appreciate it, mates. I always appreciate a lovely intro. And I think you're right. We are on this cusp of like a breakthrough, but also at the same time, when you're in that space, you seem to see it everywhere. But then when I step away to my friends that are not in this space, like still like, what the hell's breath work? What do you mean we just breathe?
Yeah,
So
yeah,
we're
yeah,
not quite there yet, but
yeah,
you and I think we're trying to push it out there a lot more.
yeah, yeah. It's so true. There's like this. It feels like it's already exploded, but then it also feels like it's going to explode. And
Mm,
I think that these things are just. I think when you're in, you know, this podcast is about you, but I've been doing various bits of the coaching, and like being in this space where we're like educating about breathing, teaching people, helping about their breathing for all different manner of things. I probably do a bit more sport based stuff, but um, it's not something that is. It can't be a fad that's gonna
mm.
go away. You know, and maybe you could speak into. That wasn't going to be one of my questions, but maybe you could speak into that. But first, just give people a little like intro. We were talking off air before I came on. I was like, man, it looks like you've been doing a lot. And like, actually, where did it all start for you? And I think when you interviewed me on your podcast, you said you'd only just like finished your full-time job. And I don't think many people will know what that was and just the journey you've been on over the last 10 or 12 or 13 years, because it makes probably make for I'm pretty sure almost 100% of the people listening to this podcast will have come across you on Instagram and your work, and if they haven't, they're going to find out an awful lot about it. But yeah, I don't think many of them will know the backstory, and then the
Mm,
backstory makes a lot of sense because you call
mm,
your, I think you've called your on your. I was looking on your site, like call yourself a breath and stress scientist, like the scientist part.
mm.
That's been something doing for a long time. So just give people a whistle stop tour
Quick,
of
quick
where that's
breakdown.
gone. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I first got into respiratory physiology at Nottingham Trent University back in 2009, maybe even 2008.
Right. So that we must have taught. Maybe I forgot this. So Nottingham,
Yeah,
because that's
yeah,
obviously where
yeah,
I'm from. Right.
yeah. So that's I was there. I was trained by Tim, like when he was an S&C coach for that. So
Right. Okay. Right. More
I was
connections.
in it. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I was in an exercise
Did we ever
physiology
fight
lab
in
with.
Walkabout once? Was that you? No. I'm joking.
I was actually I was a doorman there on a Saturday
A
night
Walkabout.
inside. Yeah,
How
in
old are
my when I
you
was at
as well? How
university.
just this is just for me.
I'm 35. So
Uh,
I was 19 probably when I was 19, 20, and I was doing shifts inside Walkabout, being the
right.
big dog, being a rugby player, chucking people out when they are doing trouble, when they are
Well,
being in
did you
trouble.
notice it? Well, because I'm 6 years older than you, but we must have crossed paths at some point. If you, because we would go and walk, we're going massively off topic now, but yeah, we would go and
Yeah,
walk
we
about
might
every week
edit this
pretty
all
much.
out.
Yeah, doing terrible things for our breathing with alcohol, probably. Um, anyway, sorry. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so I was in an exercise physiology lab, and we were assessing how strong the inspiratory muscles were. And when I did the test, I happened to be like twice as strong. My diaphragm was twice as strong as anyone else in the lab. So that made me very
Right.
curious, right? And I was like, oh, why is that? And the two professors, Dr. Michael Johnston and Graham Sharp at the time, they both said to me, can you come into the lab and do more tests? Because we've never seen it that strong. So I went to do more tests and I basically smashed them. And then I was very, very curious. So I ended
Right.
up doing like a master's degree in that area, looking at using inspiratory muscle training devices to reduce inflammation, to improve exercise recovery, et cetera, et cetera. Wanted to go into the sports science route, but it's not as easy to get into a
Yeah.
professional rugby team or a sports team unless you got contacts and stuff like that. And
Yeah.
I'm not from a wealthy family, so I couldn't just take time off and just go and volunteer.
Yeah.
But I got a placement, a scholarship in the National School of Healthcare Scientists to train as a clinical scientist
Yeah.
specializing in respiratory and sleep. Trained for 3 years at QMC
Yeah.
in the lung function labs there, and then decided to go to London. I worked at St Bart's for a short period, setting up their exercise physiology lab in the cardiology clinic. And I'd always wanted to live in Australia ever since I was 15. Yeah,
Right.
my so yeah, Johnny Wilkinson's drop goal, which is actually what 12 years ago today. No,
Yeah.
longer than that. Yeah, whatever long. It's 19 years ago today. That just cemented something in my mind.
Yeah.
and Sydney Olympics. So 2016, I moved here, and I'd gone from two of the biggest hospitals in the UK to a small little private clinic in Western Australia in Perth.
Yeah.
So seeing clients and being funded by research and being an up and coming scientist to make a really poor career choice to follow my dream to live in Australia. So
yeah.
I moved to a clinic, and basically through the private sector here, I was just observing so many people who were coming to the doctors and getting normal results and then going away without any reason to why they're feeling dizzy, burnt out, tired, stressed, not sleeping, breathing problems, etc., etc.
Yeah.
And it was mostly because of stress and anxiety.
Right.
And I got kind of a bit fed up of people leaving my office and not having any reasons to what they need to be doing. So I started Performance Through Health around about 2017 to try and help people understand stress, sleep, and breathing, and how dysfunctional breathing and poor sleep and stress can lead to symptoms that feel like sickness, but they're not. Yeah. So they were the 3 areas I worked on. Obviously, for about a year or two, I was trying to push social media. We hit 2019, and then when COVID happens, where did the eyes go? Well, the guys who could talk about stress, the guys who could help people sleep and help people breathe. And so I saw a few opportunities to go all in. Essentially, I started putting free breathwork stuff on for the people in lockdown in the UK.
Yeah.
I was getting hundreds of people on these calls just doing
nice
breathwork sessions for free to help out.
Yeah.
But then I was getting invites left, right, and center from different schools, companies to go, hey, can you come and do some education whilst we're in this lockdown to help out? So I just went, right, clinical career, going to go all in, quit the job, and then, traveled the world for 18 months whilst followed wherever COVID opened up. I just went to we went to those countries.
So when you quit, because there'll be a lot of people listening to this that are like coaches and they're self-employed, or maybe they're trying to navigate that transition. And I always think it's important to point out for people, I'm not necessarily like a business coach or anything like that, but you got to find what's right for you. Like some people, if they quit the job and go all in, like it works out.
Yes.
And we also don't hear about the people that it didn't work, the person who it didn't work out for, and they lost their house and their marriage broke up, like they're not being interviewed about the success story. So because other people sort of do it gently, it's like they go 3 days a week with their work, and but you went, when you say you quit your job and went all in, when you'd quit, you like went to, you didn't know where the money was coming from, you had no salary, you were self-employed or running your own business, right? Which has its own stresses, right?
Exactly. So there was about 3 months beforehand where I realized I wanted to get out of my company because I wasn't too happy there. So I went into the office and said, look, I'm going to go all in my business. And they said, can you go part-time? So I went for 3 days a week, and then I just saw too many opportunities, and I kind of went for it, but I don't have any assets. I had probably 10K in the bank, and that's it. And I remember one of my mentors saying to me, hey, like, are you willing to lose everything for this? I was like, lose what? I haven't got a lot. I haven't got
anything. It's good when you haven't got anything. It's quite good,
eh? I was like, if I'm in Bali and I'm stuck in a hut somewhere on a beach with my partner that I love, and I can't afford anything other than the little bit of food that I can maybe afford just in Bali, then so be it. Like, at least I'm trying to go for what I love. So I went for it, and as I said to myself, learn to fall whilst flying. Learn to fly whilst falling. And so just I had an idea of an 8-week program that I wanted to take people through. I'd had a couple people go through it and got real good results with them and testimonials, and then started to kind of jump onto XPT, Option Advantage, and all those, and started to learn a bit more about how to bring the coaching in a bit more from the stuff that I already knew, how to apply things together, and just started writing a shed load of scientific case studies and putting them on my website. And that got attention from the likes of Brian McKenzie and HP Foundation, and a few of them for obviously Patrick. And I think just gradually over time, people started to go, this guy actually knows what he's done about. Like, who is this person?
No, for sure.
He seems to have a bit of knowledge.
And I think
sorry,
I think we got time delayed. There's it's great to hear that, because I think some people, I know that there's people that there's a WhatsApp group of all the people that I've certified through the OA, and as I said off air, like your name came up as like, yes, no, because I said I was interviewing Martin for a podcast, and they said, oh, Martin's a fountain of knowledge. Like people see see that you are delving into the science and making that sort of clear and presenting it. If people haven't seen on your Instagram, like you present stuff on your Instagram like really, really well, like it's really great to see, and people are getting an awful lot out of it. And I think there'll be some people listening that might have come across you and be like, say if they're a coach and be like, oh gosh, like how would I could never understand as well as he does, and you go, well, actually, there's someone's not as good at what they do like you are without a backstory of like, okay, well, so if someone's like struggling with understanding everything at a certain depth, you say, well, have you been a respiratory scientist for 10 years? Because like Martin's got that experience before someone else is coming into it. So I think that people hearing that will help them, well, I hope will help those that find some of the science a bit like overwhelming at times, show themselves some self-compassion as like, well, the people that are really at another level like yourself, there's a reason for that, because you put the work in, and your job previously was doing that. And something that I wanted to ask you about, and we mentioned it before we jumped on there. You were saying how that experience of being in as a like a respiratory scientist, and then now going into like the breath coaching space, there's some terminology and some things that you just wouldn't hear in one and the other. So like with the classic one that you mentioned, comes up a few times, the word CO2 tolerance, and you were like, well, we talk about CO2 levels and hypercapnia and whatnot, but we wouldn't use that term. And yeah, I'd love you to speak into that a little bit, because there's a number of things that you've I really enjoy seeing on your Instagram when you take you're taking a study and you're like distilling it down and going, okay, here's a new study, this is what it is, and this is what it shows. And I think for some people, hitting your backstory, like, oh, well, actually, it makes sense why Martin understands these papers a lot easier than I may do, because a lot of people, they've never literally looked at a journal, they've never needed to for their life before, need to look at a scientific journal, and it can be off-putting for people, and they'd much prefer to look at an Instagram post where you've distilled it down for them. But take us on a little bit of a journey through, like, as a respiratory scientist, what your thoughts around the role of CO2 is, and then how, when you look at like breath coaching, there's obviously a difference in terminology that's used. Is there any other differences that you sort of, you see from your side of things?
Yeah, I mean, as a respiratory physiologist or a scientist, right, you're seeing people with dysfunctional breathing, but you're putting them on a bike and measuring every single breath. You've got ECGs on, you're doing a VO2 max test, and you're looking at, okay, what's going on with their heart, what's going on with their breathing pattern, what's going on with their metabolic system. And you have all these different graphs that you look at, and you're kind of figuring out, okay, are these people over breathing?
Yeah.
There should be certain levels of CO2 for certain points in a test, and there should be particular patterns. And you break down those patterns and you go, right, based off this pattern, it looks like the person has some form of over breathing occurring, or sporadic or erratic breathing going on. And that's how we then make the diagnosis, which obviously is a very gold standard thing, but requires very advanced training to kind of do.
Yeah.
So that was where we'd come from. And we wouldn't talk about CO2 tolerance in that sort of concept, because it's not ever something that would be considered. It was just like, here is just the CO2 level. It's hypercapnic. That's the person's
it's just not what we want it to be.
Yeah, it's not what we want it to be. Now, I would say over the last year to 18 months, my opinion has changed on the role of CO2 in breathing, based off the literature that I'm now reading from 2020, 21, 22, because there's been some advancements really, and no one really has considered ventilation as, okay, breathing frequency and tidal volume, two different separate things, so rate and depth. well, are they controlled independently? In the brain, they are. And there's different parts in the brain. Now,
Yeah.
CO2 has always been bracketed as a primary driver of ventilation, and that's just been the conversation because of what it looks like on the graphs.
Yeah.
But there is a new model by a guy called Andrea Nicolo, who basically has stated that, well, respiratory rate is behavioral. It's a learned mechanism.
Yeah.
It has nothing to do with metabolic systems. Our depth of breathing is to do with CO2. However, we can only breathe to a certain depth until it becomes mechanically inefficient. Then we start to see an increase in drive and air hunger, which is actually an emotional response, which is non-metabolic, which then drives up rate even further.
Yeah.
So it's more complex than we think, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that then what do we usually see when we see people having typical increases in CO2 tolerance? Well, we see a change in rate. We don't necessarily see a change in depth. So that made me think, well, if we're seeing change in rate, then if these new models are suggesting that rate is behavioral, then why is the behavioral side of things changing? And yet we call it CO2 tolerance. And I just questioned, is the terminology correct? And I think that obviously caused a lot of, like you say, questions like, why is he saying this? And it's just based off new literature that we get tolerant of air hunger, but air hunger is emotional. So we become tolerant of a sensation. And because we become tolerant of a sensation, we then actually change our behavior.
Yeah. I mean, it's
so
yeah, no, I was just going to say it's something that when I first got into not my training's been done through the Oxygen Advantage. Just this notion that like breathing wasn't to do with like the demand for oxygen. It was more related to this chemosensitivity CO2 was just so mind blowing to me that I definitely got like in this like, okay. And by training my, use the term CO2 tolerance, by doing things like breath holding, etc., like saw some massive improvements in things like my breathing volume, those two things, like the rate of my breathing and the depth of my breathing. And something that I was definitely taught at the start, but I didn't give it the attention, was that psychophysiological side of it. So, the model that Patrick sort of presents of like, we've got the biochemistry, the biomechanical, and then the psychophysiological. I was interested in like the CO2 tolerance or the chemosensitivity and the mechanics. I find the mechanics really interesting. And like the psychophysiological, it was sort of like, I didn't really give it as, I certainly didn't give it a third of my attention. Like I probably at the start didn't give it hardly any of my attention. And it's interesting hearing what you say. And I think there's a bit of me that thinks like, well, like I always go back to like things that we intuitively know. Like, so when someone someone jumps in an ice bath, their breathing rate increases. And it's not because suddenly they're breathing more CO2. It's because stress has an impact on our respiratory rate. And like, it's not like I feel like we do know this. I think that, as you rightly point out, that the whole bit on CO2 tolerance has maybe been like we've given that so much attention that the other side has not got as much attention. It probably doesn't. I don't know. It's, what things are like. CO2 tolerance. It sounds like sexy. We can train it, and it's like there's that side of it. But something that I think that we always know that's happening is it's never anything in isolation. There's always multiple things going on at the same time. There'll be other stuff going on that in 10 years' time will go, oh yeah, that was actually happening as well, and that makes sense. But if we take like breath holding, first session I do with like a professional rugby player breath holding, they might be able to do 10 seconds or however many steps or whatever the thing is. By the end of that one session, we've doubled it or whatever. and we haven't done anything in terms of their CO2 tolerance. And I says we've
Mhm.
worked on your I call it like mental, but I like it because it's actually building on mental resilience,
Yeah.
and changing your psychological relationship with those sensations, all what you're saying that, and this is, this is the type of conversation I was hoping that we were going to have, to go like, for people that sometimes, I think it depends how if you're a coach, how long you've been doing this for and how well you really understand what's going on will dictate whether you sort of get a bit flustered by some what might seem like new information to us. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, definitely, mate. And I agree. And I think the way the CO2 tolerance word has came about is because it's tried to make it a basic understanding. In fact, it's probably come from freediving initially, right?
Yeah.
And freediving have looked into, okay, well, what is the breathing components? And most freedivers are not going to be respiratory physiologists, so it's
Yeah.
then it's simplistic. Now, how do I have an issue with that word? No. Tolerance to do, because I think there is a point where we can dissociate and just push ourselves and not actually have the experience of feeling a sensation.
Yeah.
We can go after goals and performance, but we'll digress a little bit. Bringing it back a little bit, I think that psychophysiological component is, and it is something that has been missed, maybe because it's difficult to understand, because it's the psychology
Yeah.
element to it, and that mind body is still relatively a new area in science itself, like interoception and all that sort of stuff. Is people are and emotions, like the
Yeah.
scientists still don't understand
It's
what is the
difficult to
origin of
measure.
emotion. Yeah. So I think it is something, an area that's kind of lacked in a lot of certifications, and it was something that I became very fascinated just because I started to see these different points of literature, and then I started to point Brian McKenzie towards these pieces of literature,
Yeah.
and he was like, because I looked at his work and I knew he was touching on the edge of like a lot of the things that I was seeing in that
Yes.
psychophysiological area, and there was a few things that, whilst he went deep down rabbit holes, I started to point in these directions into certain papers, and he was like, "You're starting to make a bit more sense. Like, this is
Okay.
great. Do you want to have a chat?"
Yeah.
And
Nice.
that pretty much then became a chat pretty much every week or every 2 weeks behind the scenes of just going through papers and discussing these papers around what he's been looking at, what he's been observing, what I've been observing, and
Yeah.
tying things together. So then I got really, obviously, again, I'm just an excited nerd, really, mate, and then just went down an avenue of, I'd always been a person who was very interested in psychology because I suffered with anxiety and depression for a very long time myself.
Okay.
And I used breath work to get myself through that.
Nice.
But also I realized there was an element of this somatic component, just feeling in general,
Yeah.
feeling into your feelings. And a lot of the breath allows you to do that, right? Just increase
Yeah.
the self-awareness. So
Yeah.
just a rabbit hole of, I guess, digging into that area that was probably, I'm not going to say a weak point, but just a point that isn't focused on that much, and making observations.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess it's easier to measure levels of CO2 than it is to measure someone's physiological or psychological sort of um, response. The feeling, I think something that it's cool to hear you say that. And there's always people have, if they get into sort of, I always think if you get into like breath training, breath work, it's and go deep. There's always a story. There's always a reason why. So hearing that it's impacted you. You've used it in that way.
Massively.
Yeah, it's one of the things that makes us, I think, or helps people to be good at coaching it as well, because you've genuinely used it, and the impact it has on you, you can't not be passionate about it, you know. So other things that I think, and this is, I want drawing on, I think, your experience and what I think you're very good at and would be helpful for other people. If you're going to look at, and it looks like it's happening fairly regularly, and you did it, you just mentioned there, like you were doing it every week with Brian McKenzie. When you're looking at a study, when you're looking at a scientific paper, can you give us a little bit of for people that have maybe want to, but because of their background maybe didn't you know, at university, for example, I did a master's in materials engineering, nothing to do with breathing,
Hmm.
but you know,
Hmm.
during your dissertation, you had to do like a big lit review and blah blah, and like you just get there's the process of like looking at a study, looking at a journal. Like how do you choose um, whether you should trust this particular? What are you looking for in terms of like
Mm.
I don't know, sample sizes or the journal itself, or like you know, yeah, just give us a little bit of an overview, and then maybe we can jump into
Yeah,
to a couple.
sure. Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, to set a backstory to that is that from 2008 onwards, I pretty much committed to reading 2 scientific papers every single day.
Every
Sometimes I
day.
miss. I try to do that
Nice.
every single day. Now, initially, obviously, I was very slow at it. Now you can imagine, what was it now? 15 years later,
Do you
it's
still
almost like
do
a
two a
skim reading.
day?
Like I try to get through 2 a day. Yeah,
Weekend? Do you ever give yourself a
and
weekend? Sure, weekend off. No, I
okay,
hope
well,
so.
weekends off, and yeah.
Good.
So I probably will get, okay. Let's say I'll probably get through between 10 to 12, and sometimes they're papers that I'll read and go, they were a load of rubbish, and just like
Yeah.
won't even.
Yeah.
I'll
Okay.
just I'll skim through them and go, that's not even pointless. There's no point talking to that. It's just a terrible paper. Now,
So
how do
yeah,
I know that? How do I
what
know that?
makes you make that decision?
Well, number one, kind of like there are reputable papers that you kind of learn as a scientist, that you might have something like Journal of Applied Physiology or European Journal of Applied Physiology or
Yeah.
Nature or Cell, which there's something called impact factor that you can look at. And
Okay.
that is basically the impact it has on the scientific community. So the higher
Yes.
that number is, the more established that paper is. And generally, traditionally, actually, that was considered that would be a better paper. Now papers seem to have gone down a bit of a commercial route, and
Right.
sometimes even like Nature and Cell can write some really terrible studies and get them published, which I don't understand. But so that's one case of it. You might find a journal somewhere that's like International Journal of so and so in Tunisia, Bangkok, wherever it is, like, and it's just like someone owns that journal. And I've had people approach me and say, hey, look, write a blog and we'll publish it in a journal. And I'm like, no. And then they say, oh, do you want to pay for to have it published in our journal? Like, well, no, because number one, 99% of journals don't get read. And I'm not going to pay for something for someone to know, not read my stuff.
Yeah.
I can
Yeah.
post it
Yeah.
on social media and have
Yeah.
people read
Yeah.
it. So I'll usually, obviously, looking into, first of all, I'm just looking into finding something that I enjoy. So I'm typing in on Google Scholar, breath work, nasal breathing, whatever it is I decide to look
Yeah.
at that day. Just, it might be something that I want to particularly touch on a certain area. If I'm building certification, then I'll scroll through 2023 latest papers and then look at which ones are reasonably good journals, and they're free, because you can only, like, if it's not free, then I can't share it because it's behind
Yeah.
copyright walls and I can't put it on
Yeah.
social media, and there's trouble there.
Yeah.
Well, there probably isn't, but trying to stick to regulations.
Yeah.
Then I'll have a quick look at the abstract, and does the abstract kind of like give you anything interesting to share? Into the, I don't really want to share something that's bland on social media. Again, that's moving away from the scientist. If I was a
Yeah.
scientist, I'd look into it a little bit deeper, but I don't have to go and critique a paper now anymore. I can kind of just find something that might be quite interesting
Yeah.
and share that. I like to connect dots now rather than looking into weeds of different things. But if the abstract looked pretty good, then it's a quick look at, okay, first lines of the discussion and to see what they found. Then go back to the intro. And then finally, I'll look into the methodologies to see how they actually did the study. And if I really want to, then obviously a scientist can go deeper and go,
Yeah.
you know, what's the sample size? What's the statistics they've ran?
Yeah.
You know, is it large enough to be an actual true effort and, you know, really good science, or is it not? And then I might have a look at, is there another paper that has similar results? And if there's a few
Yeah.
papers that show similar results, then I'll then go, okay, right, now I'm starting to
Yeah.
maybe agree. There's an agreement here.
Yeah.
Or is there an agreement at a different level of analysis? Maybe someone's looking at it from the physiological component, and someone's looked at it from the metabolic component, and someone's looking at it from a mechanical component. And do they overlap? And if they overlap,
Yeah.
again, it looks like there's more truth. So then I'll change my opinion on something.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and like in the discussion, they'll be referencing other studies
Mhm.
that are similar, and so
Yeah, yeah.
people you
So
will
yeah,
they'll
and
be you'll be
you
able
can look
to
at those. You can look at those studies, and you can look at who cited those studies, and you look at the future studies, and go, right, there's future ones there. So you can. That's what you learn as a is at university, and when you
yeah
go into your masters and you go to do research, it's just you learn how to pull that stuff together and
yeah
find new interesting bits and old papers. And then you might find a new paper that publishes in 2023, but you've read a paper 2 or 3 weeks ago that was published in 1993, and you're going, right, if I look at that paper with a new set of eyes
yeah
from research from 30 years later, can I then pull something out of that paper that they didn't see in that
at the
paper because they
time,
didn't
yeah,
understand it?
for sure,
And you go,
yeah
now that makes sense. Like
yeah
30 years later, they've kind of like they're lapping over.
yeah yeah
So yeah,
yeah
that's just
yeah, and not that my next statement isn't going to be to diminish, like if there's like a if there's something for something to be discovered, like we've got to be the only one that, at some point uh, someone was going, the world isn't flat, it's round, and everyone
yeah,
thinks they're an idiot.
yeah.
And now it's probably a little bit the other way around. Not for
Mm,
everyone, but generally speaking, if you're thinking, or you find a paper that has links to other things, and they're all sort of pointing towards the same direction, then
mm,
we can generally take trust in, like, okay, we've got some trustworthy sources of information that are separate entities, but they're pointing towards the same thing. Hence why we can go, that's probably something um,
mm.
that I can trust.
And
It's
and
just
then as a
sensible, isn't it?
practitioner, yeah, then as a practitioner or a coach, is that also like, that's also what I see with my clients and people
Yeah,
as well. It's making sense. Like now there's real world application. As a scientist, I know that science is behind the practitioners.
yeah,
The practitioners are in front of it because they're on the front line trying new things, testing new
doing it.
things. Patrick, Brian, the likes have been doing it in the field for a long time.
Yeah,
They might not have it perfect, but they're probably ahead of people in terms of understanding the mechanisms and the science behind it because they're applying it and seeing how it works.
yeah. I think, and it's what's important as a coach. So take Patrick McKeown, for example, whose practical application has probably been the widest out of everyone in the whole entire
Mm,
world, 21 years, that he wants to help people. He knows what
mm,
works and he knows what doesn't work
mm.
because he's done it with tens of thousands of people. And I think there's understanding all of our different roles. We all have a slightly different role to play. Of like, are you at that end of it, or are you at the research end of it? Take
Yeah.
someone like Xavier Warruns, who's done loads of the breath holding stuff. Like, as far as I'm aware,
Mm,
he's not on YouTube. He doesn't have an Instagram account. He's not trying to be famous or what. He's a scientist that, for whatever reason,
mm.
loves breath holding, and he's loves to. And it's like, he's some. I'd love to meet him because he's clearly someone that just is like, yeah, this is my space. I'm up in it, and I'm just going. This is me. I'm flourishing here, and
Yeah.
you know, we can be other people at the other end of the spectrum. And then there's people that weave between the two. You do the science, but you do the education, you do mentor, and I'm assuming you people can work with you as you do the direct
Yeah. Yeah.
coaching to the end person as well.
Yeah.
So you're across the board, but we don't all have to do all things. What I think is important for.
No.
I'm speaking to coaches that are listening here, where we're like, sometimes it can be very easy to like see someone else doing something. Oh no, I need to do more of that, and it's like, well done, you need to do what you need to do. Um,
Master your role first and find that role. That's that, honestly, because it's authenticity, right? At the end of the day. I initially, I think when I was getting onto social media, there was a lot that I knew, I was afraid to put it all out there because I didn't want to be seen as this kind of like science nerdy person who
yeah,
like overwhelmed everyone. And I think I actually did that for a long period of time
right.
because I didn't have that audience. My first, maybe I'd say 5,000 followers. I remember going home one day and my dad said to me, "Oh, I love that you're on social media, but I have no idea what you're saying." Yeah. And I was like, that's why I'm not getting that many coaching clients
Yeah,
because I'm going over their head.
right.
Now, so then I started to dim things down and I started getting more clients through, which, the basics and fundamentals is what
Yeah,
brings people through. And then all of a sudden I had a few coaches reach out to me and say, "Hey, look, you know what you're doing. Do you do a mentorship?"
yeah,
And I was like, no, I don't. And then too many
I'll
asked and
make
said,
one.
okay,
Yeah.
I'll make one. Be with me every 2 weeks and I'll have a lecture for you ready. And then that just became
Yeah.
this huge thing of a portal and stuff. And, the breath science certification. Then I changed back to sharing more of the deeper science. And then the audience was there
Yeah.
because I'd already been pitching to that audience for years anyway, but not getting
Yeah.
much traction on it. And then
Yeah.
all of a
Yeah.
sudden
Yeah.
they were like, oh, we've been waiting for you to kind
Yeah.
of move into this educational role and educate us on the science a bit. And it just
And
seemed
you
to
were
have
like, I was already here doing it, but you just weren't there.
yeah. So it's coming in a full circle, really, I think, of making mistakes and learning those mistakes and then realizing serendipitously, like, oh, okay, that's my audience. Now let's
Yeah.
maybe tailor towards that audience.
Yeah. No, making mistakes and learning, that's life.
100%, mate.
It's life.
Oh, massively.
Um, so some other things then I'd like to one question I wanted to ask you is like, what about the danger of one study? Like,
Mm,
um, it can be easy. Like there was one. I think I'm sure I saw this because you'd posted about it. The hands on knees versus hands on head
mm,
for recovery. It was 24 female football or soccer players, and and this is a little bit, maybe we can share a little. This is a little bugbear of mine, that it's great that like we're just as a the scientific community in general, there's far more people, like the likes of Huberman, for example, who's like putting out, like a neuroscientist, like putting out information that just Joe Public can get, and it's
mm,
fantastic. But there's a danger sometimes with what gets probably the short form version. Like if something's going to go on Instagram, it's going to be short and it
mm-hmm,
can't have the detail that it perhaps needs to do. And that study, for example, I'm sure we would both agree that we're fairly certain it would replicate for males, but
mm.
technically you don't know if that is going to work for males because the study was only 24 females, and that's a relatively small sample size. It just made me think of like, are there any? Yeah, is it? Well, how do you feel about like when one study is getting quoted for something? How do you? Yeah, the danger of one study, is that something that you think
Yeah,
carefully about, or yeah, how do you approach it?
I think that sort of thing, of course you've got to be mindful, and and again, like it's when you're coming from a science background, it's different if you've heard it on Huberman podcast, for example, and Huberman's not been able to go. A classical example is fat loss and cold exposure. Like that whole argument is just, it's so out there in the public eye, but the scientists are just like, what are you on about? Like,
Yeah,
there's
yeah,
not really that much literature on it. And so there is I think there is a, what would the word be, like it, these papers or this info can misconstrue when it gets out to a large audience.
yeah,
I think that's the right word.
yeah.
So having one paper or just a couple of papers, you're right, this might be in elite athletes, and does that work for someone who's in sedentary? Or in fact,
Yeah.
I just talked about nitric oxide the other day, and most of the papers on nitric oxide are in people who are on ventilators and have really poor lung function and terrible alveoli, and have supplemented nitric oxide and
Yeah.
it's improved it. And then there's components of like, well, it just blasted at nitric oxide is this best thing in the whole wide world for breathing. And it's like, well, still the literature's not quite there, but we can make speculations and we
Yeah.
can talk about it and we can add it into this and that, and we can use it as a story to help people to buy into things. And that becomes, whilst I'm in a position where I think that helps because it's helping people to come in to maybe understand something.
Yeah.
But then the other side of me, the scientist, is also aware that, okay, well, if I was still an academic or was in a role of science still, I would probably criticize a lot more.
Mm.
And I was having a conversation with a guy the other day, and he was like, I really appreciate how you do things on social media. He's got, he's a PhD student, and
Yeah.
he's like, I can't do that
Yeah.
because you just get ridiculed by the academics,
Yeah.
because you have to go into so much detail when you're looking at a study to really, and then you've got to have the layers on top, and then you've got to have the meta-analysis, and
Yeah.
then you've got to go, right, okay, does that all agree with each other? Who did the meta-analysis? How many
Yeah.
people? And then
Yeah.
the scientists go, I think we've found truth, but we're not sure still because who knows?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that there's sort of the last question maybe on this from me is understanding bias and or appreciating bias, like the bias that potentially is there, but then also my bias reading it, like if it's something that's going to help reaffirm something that I'm seeing with my clients, I'm biased, and I need,
Yeah.
and probably what you're describing with the from a more scientific perspective, we should perhaps be coming firstly being critical and trying to be critical, and then if it passes that test, it's a little bit more more reliable. It's just, I think, just appreciating
Mm.
your own bias is something that, and appreciating the bias of the person who's maybe delivering the information to me. If that's how I'm, if I'm not reading the paper directly and I'm just
Mm.
taking information from, that, if from the likes of yourself or from Hoodman or
Yeah,
whoever it
yeah,
is,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
I want to try and be aware of the potential bias that they may have.
yeah, yeah. And not even that, just the level of like, it's called transference, and it moves through authority. It's like, if you're an authority in the field, you can say something, and the people who are listening to you, who see you maybe as a role model, will just go, I'm with you.
Yeah,
Yeah. Without critically thinking about it
yeah,
or going whatever. It's like, I just believe what this person's saying because they're such a genius, they're this, then that. And that can be taken down an avenue of selling you stuff. It
yeah,
can be a part of a business model, and it can be a part of whatever it is, this and that. And social media can feed that to a certain extent, especially around a lot of, I guess, the controversial things and the terminology around things, because that's what social media does, right? Is it feeds things that are unique and controversial.
yeah,
So that's why there's a lot of it out there. And so I think we have to be mindful just to every now and then just go, right, who else can I ask? Who else can I speak to? Can I learn a bit more from somewhere else? And does someone else, does it all agree? And then make my own
yeah,
assumptions, then apply it in the field. And if it
yeah.
applies in the field and it works, do you know what? You're a practitioner. So if it works, it works.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And if you apply and it doesn't work, it doesn't matter that the study said it worked because it didn't work in reality.
Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah,
think,
yeah, yeah. And then you've learned something, and your clients learned something as well.
yeah,
Okay, that well, it didn't work for you. I apply things. I work with people for 2 or 3 months, right? And then we'll go through and I'll apply things, and they'll go, "No, I don't like that." Cool.
yeah,
I've just found out that you don't like to
yeah,
do
yeah. It's a
strong
good data point
methods.
when it doesn't work.
Yeah,
Yeah,
cool. Right, we won't do that then because it makes you feel more stressed and you can't sleep when you do that. So I'm going to pull that back out again, and maybe we can dig in a little bit and figure out why, and that might give some coping mechanism or something like that. But if not, we'll just try and change it and navigate for your needs because
yeah,
you're the person who I'm trying to serve.
yeah. But
I'm
I
not
think
serving
you,
the science.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And you highlighted something at the beginning of that I think is really important, that and self-awareness, people need to be aware of this, of um what did you say, it was transference, the word of, like,
Transference, yeah.
yeah, if um someone in highly regarded says something, and if I'm just like, if my immediate response is like, yeah, I'm with you, I need to try to just back off a second and go like, am I just doing that because I really trust this person, like this person, or does that actual thing make sense? Because I believe,
Mm,
correct me if I'm wrong, I believe it was Spider-Man that said, with great power becomes great responsibility, which
yeah,
despite doing Spider-Man is actually really quite true. Let's switch gears slightly,
sure, mate.
to ask you. Um, there's two questions. You can choose them in either order because they're slightly related. One is like, what's the biggest myth within breathing that you think? I know you touched on the CO2 tolerance, like wording, but is
Mm.
there any particular breathing myth that sort of we miss it, that people would benefit from understanding what's really going on. It might be just a bit wrong, or your biggest bugbear, biggest bugbear. That's what I don't know what I said before. Biggest bugbear. Like, what's
Maybe
the thing?
the thing that frustrates me.
What's the thing that
Is
annoys
that what
you?
you're asking?
Yeah, is there something that you find a bit frustrating, or it could just be like, people just don't get this point, and I really want them to.
That's a tough one. That is a tough one.
Well, and
I
yeah, I
mean,
mean, the myth might be the bugbear.
yeah. For me, it's, I don't know. I think it's the argument between, is it this or is it that? Like, can we use things like conscious connected breathing and hyperventilation for a means, or should we just all be nasal breathing and slow breathing? I think the separation there frustrates me, because it's like become like a, not everyone, but it's a bit of a, there's a
Bit of
fight, and
people
that
being
fight's
black and white.
black and white, and it's not to sometimes I just don't think on one side of the argument the others are wanting to try and understand it. Like, there's not that open curiosity, which is what I really like to, that's why I became a scientist, right? Curiosity is a high value of mine, of course. So I think looking at things black or white and just going, nah, you shouldn't do that because so and so says it's bad for you. And well, you should be doing this all the time because it's amazing.
Yeah.
So if I break that down a little bit more, is that, well, maybe these people who are using hyperventilation style breathworks, yes, there is a whole spiritual community that have always been in that community and have always used that for the type of work they're doing. And yes, there's maybe the Buteyko background, which is, we're already over breathers and we shouldn't be doing that at all. But let's look at the specificity of the role of it and how it can actually be applied maybe every now and then. Yeah, I guess I'm getting at is the specificity of coaching.
Yeah.
The specificity within breath work, I think, lacks. I think it's like methodology is almost a thing that's sold quite well, rather than understanding really the deeper reasons to what's actually happening and why we're using it, and then applying it in that way. That's what I would say, probably would say that I feel is my biggest frustration.
Yeah. I think that I agree with you that there's a bit of like, it's a coaching thing, one of so Tim, who he was 10 years ago when I started like my S&C career after retiring from my brain injury of rugby. One of the first things he said to me when he was mentoring me as an S&C coach was, coach the athlete in front of you. Meaning like, you might have on your program 5x5 at this rep blah blah blah, but they come in and like, it could be any manner of things, like the dog's died, or training yesterday was hard, or whatever, anything. And so the context of what you're going to do with that person needs to be based on like what that person needs, but that might be that comes from like assessment on a particular day that isn't today. And I guess it's the right thing for the right person. Like we were, it's like, I like to try and use scenarios that aren't breathing related sometimes to try and help us understand something. So like, and I'll often go to like my S&C sort of world, where I think of like, the mechanics of breathing. It's a movement, so we can go like, well, let's take another movement that's a little bit less abstract and like a squat that people know or whatever. But we were at a shoulder conference with a load of physios and doctors and things. And the surgeon that spoke, the solution was always surgery. And you're like, but that's because you're a surgeon. Like, if you got a hammer, everything's a nail. And it's like, if you only teach Buteyko, then potentially you only have one solution for everyone. And I think it's, like you say, it's the right thing for the right person at the right time. And it might be someone, I had Connie, I'm going to forget her surname, who she's basically trained in everything. And she'll be like, if someone wants to do a hyperventilation practice, it will be, firstly, looking at as to why, like what's their desire for this? What are they searching for? And then there's
Hmm.
like, right, well, they've got to have a certain level of CO2 tolerance, sensitive. They've got to have a BOLT score of a certain
Mm.
level.
Yeah, yeah.
They've got to have good functional breathing before we then transit, and then it's not something that they do every day. They get educated understanding what days it is applicable, what days it's not. I had this
Hmm.
conversation with someone the other day of like, literally yesterday about, well, actually, he was somebody that was really struggling with like a mental breakdown. Had a mental breakdown. It was like it started doing some cold exposure, some ice baths. Maybe you could speak to this
Hmm.
in terms of stress. And he's like, yeah, I'm trying to do it every day. And I was like, and I'm not the expert on this, but it's like, where does this thing of like we've got to then do everything, we've got to do things every day come from? And like, there's days where, and as what's difficult is, there's days where I've got an ice bath outside. There's days where you don't want to go in, but you make yourself go in and you feel better for it. And then there's other days
Mm.
where you don't want to go in, so you don't go in, and you either feel better for not going in because it wasn't what your body actually needed that day, or you feel bad because you feel guilty because you should have done it, and then you remember the
Mm.
days where you. And this is probably something you can speak into because this is then more it's to do with the emotions and the. But I just think too many of us these days put too much pressure on ourselves that then even if the thing is good for us, it's making us it's affecting our emotional state and physiological state negatively because of how we're thinking about it. We had
Yeah.
have you used heart math before?
I've not used it. I've heard of it, and obviously I'm aware it's HRV work and stuff like that, but I've not
Yeah.
actually used
Well,
it.
so just very quickly, and then because it relates to this, um, because my wife uses it with some of her clients, and basically, like you're breathing in coherence. It's a measurement of heart rate variability, but you're breathing, say, like 5 in, 5 out to get into coherence, and the screen like goes green when you're like
Mm.
in the right zone, and it's quite easy to get people there. And then you can ask them, just think of something that you really hate or upsets you or annoys you, and it immediately goes red. Immediately, you don't change your breathing pattern, but you immediately drop out of coherence just from a thought. And I'm like,
Yeah.
how dangerous thinking is. um,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
speak into that
Yeah.
stress piece a little bit
Yeah.
because maybe I've said one of my bugbears that people just want to do things every day.
Yeah. I think that's just an attachment to a identity, right? Like of needing to be better, needing to be healthy, needing to do something, and believing that this is the answer. And that then attachment is then what creates the emotional kind of arousal state within someone. And then the negative and the positive is, did they achieve that attachment or not? Did they move forward or did they move backwards? So like the element, and we all get attached to things, and
Yeah,
particularly this is very interesting when it comes to performance mindsets, because like being the best and being a performer is then you've already set yourself an attachment. Now, if we take that back to breath work, or to walking apneas, for example, when you tell an athlete like, hey, look, I want you to be able to do 30 or 40 steps on an empty long breath hold this week and hit that range every week. They will do that regardless of how they feel, how they've slept,
yeah,
however they've done this, because
yeah,
they're an athlete. They will push through and just dissociate from the feeling and the pain and just go through it because it's a goal orientation element of it.
yeah,
Yet that's maybe not a part of the psychophysiological process that maybe we should be feeling into that and be aware and build self-awareness around when to push and when to pull.
yeah,
So that I think when we have attachments to things, it removes us from the value of learning about ourselves, of when to apply these things, which should be the outcome of coaching for, I would say, health anyway. Performance
yeah,
could be different. To build that awareness of, okay, knowing when to go into a stressor and knowing when to not,
yeah,
versus just going, I need to do that because so and so said it's good for you.
yeah. Well, and there's the thing I love about the breathing is it gives you a, I've always said before, and this will actually bring me into my last question for you. I always said before that I, as a rugby player, was very much taught, not taught, but you develop a way to not feel your body. You get good at not
Yeah.
feeling your body because most of I played 316 games of professional rugby, and I'd have had some sort of injury or niggle for like a significant percentage, way over 50% of them, probably alarmingly high. So you get good at not listening to your body. So if you ask yourself, or someone asks you how you doing, you're like, I'm all right. Like, whereas if you're to go, as in like, do you have any idea about how your nervous system is? You're like, well, I don't know. I'm not sleeping very well at the moment, or whatever. Yeah. So the breathing is a reflection of how your nervous system is going, and that's been one thing that,
yeah, 100%.
yeah, been for me
I think
useful, helpful.
I think the overarching theme with breathing and focusing on breathing is building awareness around state, right? And being where you are and where you are, like even just doing something like an MBT test can show you where you are in your nervous system regulation, because if you're very unregulated, you're going to hit maybe 10 steps and be like, oh, no, I'm all over the
freak
place.
out.
And then you just teach them to calm down and relax, and they go to 20 or 30 steps simply from just getting themselves a bit more regulated.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think the breath, and everyone I've spoke to says it's generally about building awareness.
Yeah.
And you're right. Athletes can just go, don't listen to your body. You're injured, you're ill, but you've still got to get out there and you've got to score 5 tries and you've got to win the game because you paid to do it.
That's a whole another rabbit hole. But yeah, no, my final question was, I guess related to that, was something that I've really took from breathing massively to understand myself, my nervous system better. And I think, and the other thing you made me think of there was like, when you've got to do a breathing practice, that not all of them have to be, but there's a portion of them where you're just going to sit there and breathe. Like, that's part of it. It's like it's a meditative practice in itself, without you thinking you're basically meditating potentially at the start. And that desire to like always be progressing or getting better at something, rather than just simply being and accepting. Yeah. But my last question is, what do you wish you knew when you were first starting out? You know, you'd quit the job and you're like, right, I'm going down this. I'm going to be educating coaches. I'm going into mentoring. You've run your breath science certification now, and you're working with clients. Like, what do you know now that you wish you knew back then?
I think it would be not to get so stuck in what just the science says. I've applied so many things that are creative ideas that have really worked out for people, that are based off understanding, but not necessarily, what the science would say you need to do. So I think there is an element of that. You don't need to know everything to be a really good coach. That probably did hold me back for a long period of time to actually making the full transition, going all the way in.
Yeah.
Because I'm obviously like to dive into papers for a reason, and that's because it makes me it's my escapism. I can avoid my emotion, I can avoid all these things by just being more intelligent and more smart. Now I've managed to integrate that shadow to make it work for me, and people pay me to be that person. But it has been a shadow of mine, and I think that in itself made me go down a rabbit hole of like, I can't apply these things until I fully understand it to the level of maybe someone else does over here. Like, so I might start reading into neuroscience and go, I can't actually use this until I'm Andrew Huberman. I could just listen to someone just go, well, apply it this way, and then try it and see if it works, and apply it.
No, it's really, really good, mate. Thank you for your honesty. And I think there'll be I know a lot of coaches that, when they've done the DOA certification, either with myself or with Patrick, say, where they're just starting out and they don't actually get started because they're worried that they don't know enough. And I always say, like, do 100%. You know enough to teach the basics? Because the basics are going to be life-changing for so many people. Thank you for your time. For people, so they can, I'm sure they'll be intrigued, they want to know more. what's your social handles, and then what have you got coming up? I know you said you've got for the UK listeners a breath science certification coming up, which is a 6-month mentorship. Just tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah. So you can find me pretty much all over the internet, Performance Through Health. And yeah, my certification, breathscience.com.au. Drop me a message. I've got end of January, starting a 6-month cohort. There's already 4 people signed up. We've got 6 spaces left. I've not even put out to the world yet. And yeah, we'll be going through bi-weekly sessions into 12 different modules covering breathing, emotions, sleep, psychology, and assessing and coaching structures. So trying to build long programs to help people learn how to actually coach. That is not method based, it's principle based.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah. So people go check Martin out on Instagram. Instagram's probably a good place to connect if they have questions to follow up on. Then yeah, thank you for your time, mate. It's always a pleasure to speak to you. And before we went on air, I was trying to coax him to coming back to the UK for an event. So if people are interested, I'd like to get Martin over here and we do an event together at some point in 2024, maybe.
That'd be amazing.
Yeah, if you're a listener and you're like, yes, I would definitely come to that event, send us a message, and I'll start to build up a data points of people that want to come, and I'll say, Martin, look, I've presented. Here's the information. You need to come over and let's make this happen. Here's the science. Let's make this happen. Cool.
All right, mate. Thank you very much.
Take care.
It's been a great chat.
Cheers, dude. Bye. Okay, there we go. Martin on the podcast. Hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. I hope you were able to take away a lot for your own understanding of breathing and how you may apply it for yourself, or if you're a coach, how you'd apply it with your clients as well. And what we just mentioned there at the end, he is from the UK and has family in the UK, so there is a chance of him coming back to the UK next year. And I said to him, look, I would love us to do an event together. If you would be interested in Martin and myself doing an event together, I'm thinking a weekend thing. If he's coming all the way over from Australia, a weekend thing, a weekend event. Would you be interested in that? Would you like to see the two of us come together to run an event in the UK? Let me know. Drop me a message on Instagram, jacko.david.jackson. Drop us a message if that would be of interest to you, if you'd be keen. Let's see what the interest is like. Please don't think that everyone else that's going to come is going to send a message and so you just won't bother. Send us a message. I'll start badgering Martin and we'll get him over here. It'd be cool to do something, cool to do an event together. I would absolutely love that. And one of the things I love most is coaching in person, and so meeting all of you. So yeah, I would love to make that happen. Other than that, I just want to say massive thank you for listening. If you haven't yet subscribed, or if you haven't watched, it's on YouTube or on Spotify. It's on Apple Podcasts. It's on all the podcast platforms, wherever you want to listen to it. I would massively appreciate you doing one of two things, or both of them. Subscribing and giving us a review, or sharing this with a friend or family member or someone that you think would benefit from understanding themselves and their breathing a little bit better. I'd love you to share the Between Breaths podcast, maybe even take a little screenshot of the last episode that you've listened to and share that on Instagram. Tag us in, and maybe just a little note of what you took from it. Would love to hear from you. So thank you as ever for listening. You've been breathing. I've been Jacko. Until next time, keep it nasal.